Welcome to Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I'm Jodelle Onstad, and this is episode 117. We are delving into God's healing code, the code that He has for worldwide reformation, the ability to make a difference, to make a change, not just in a very small, isolated group of people, but to affect real, lasting change in hearts and minds today. In Leviticus 19:17, Yahweh gives us a glimpse. He gives us a instruction for how we are supposed to do this. He tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, our brother, those around us. But he actually even goes further than that. He tells us that in order to adequately love our neighbor, it requires some correction, some rebuke, some contending with. So the word in this verse in Leviticus 19:17 is the Hebrew word yakach, and it actually means to argue with and correct. But it's been my experience that we do not like this. We turn away from it. We reject it. We think that somebody's being mean, they're being ugly, they're hurting our feelings, they're challenging us. But if you guys have ever been a part of anything that is worthwhile, whether it's a company, an organization, maybe you're working on your doctoral thesis, the one thing that you know is you're going to get a lot of reproof and a lot of correction. And with that comes growth. It challenges your preconceived ideas. It challenges you to go beyond the status quo. And that can be wonderful and exuberating, thrilling, but very painful and heart-wrenching all at the same time. They're it's like this massive dark hole where all these things, all these feelings and emotions, all of these factors are compacted all at the same time, and they kind of all war against each other. And throughout human history, we tend to be more comfortable. We want the status quo. When it comes to change, when it comes to healing, when it comes to correction, we would rather have instant gratification. We want the quick and easy fix. In our families, when we face issues of physical abuse, gambling, addictions, sexual abuse, we ignore it and we sweep it under the rug. Families have, believe it or not, we think we're so advanced, but families still have internal struggles today. Struggles for dominance and control over the vulnerable and more weaker members of our family. And then this scenario exports. It becomes part of greater society, of our communities and our churches. Look at how many churches today where it is discovered that the pastor was molesting half of his congregation, or the priest, the Spotlight expose in 1999 discovered that tens of thousands of priests were guilty of this very crime. But it also occurs in our families, and we ignore it. And because we don't challenge the little things, we don't challenge the lies that lead us down this path, we don't ever grow. We're stuck in the status quo, and we fight for the status quo. We hold on to it with both hands as a firm grip, as though the very sins that destroy us give us our comfort and save us. And we don't realize that we are destroyed, not just simply for a lack of knowledge, but for holding on to the very lies that were often embraced generations and centuries before us today. Leviticus 26:39, which has been part of our study in this series, warned us that we would pine away, we would fester in our ancestors' iniquities throughout the diaspora. Rather than confronting our sins, we would make excuses for them. We would seek to justify those sins and deny the healing that Yahweh has for us. But in the very next two verses after Leviticus 26:39, Yahweh discloses this amazing revolutionary healing code whereby we can vanquish and reverse those sins, the sins of the fathers that have been iniquities that are in part of the way we thinking, our culture, the very who we are. But it isn't a quick and easy fix. There is no instant gratification, and the process can be heart-wrenching. Growth, again, does not always come easy. It comes with contending with those sins. And today we do remain divided. We continue to be affected by the choices that our ancestors have made. And I want to give you just a little example, a very modern example of how very recent choices and very recent history affects our prosperity and our culture today. And I'm going to use America because I think most of us that tune in are Americans, but you can really, if you're in Europe, if you're in Australia, you can look at your own history and you can see this in your own history. So a great example is actually the state of Texas. The state of Texas is only one part of the United States of America. Yet its history, which is, only 150 years old, affects the rest of the United States by what Texas has done, both historically and even modernly. Texas comprises 10% of the U.S. economy, and it contributes 38 federal congressional representatives. But had not Texas defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, America would look much different. Texas's past history and it continues to affect America today. And society, even perhaps world history, would look much different had Sam Houston not defeated Santa Anna. That economy, the oil reserves, the prosperity that began in the 1930s, 1940s, or even early 1900s with the huge oil industry would have benefited Mexico. And even more modernly, it would have prospered its drug cartels and been a tremendous threat to America over the ages. But because of the fact that Santa Anna was defeated, Texas became a state, it has now provided a tremendous blessing for America. So we can see where just one little part of the overall United States of America affects us. It affects our national history. Even though not all of us are Texans, we are still affected by what Texas has done and the choices that Texas and her forefathers have made 150 years ago to us today. In this series, we have been discussing the defining points in Israel's covenant. And one of the most defining traits in Israel's covenant, it's not even unique to Israel. Even though it is central, it is the key phrase and the key point that is reiterated 5 different times. It functions equally among all nations and among all humanity. And that is that the sins and the choices of our ancestors are passed down 3 and 4 generations later. Israel's covenant emphasized this, that the 3rd and 4th generations are often the generations that bear the brunt of the choices, of the policies, of the sins, or even the prosperity that are created by our ancestor and their choices. Now, we've seen in past episodes, and if we began this in episode 111, and if you haven't seen those, I invite you to go back and research those because it really lays out what Yahweh is talking about. I mean, I didn't understand the depth of this, where we see that cancer, we see heart disease, all of these are passed down generation to generation because our forefathers decided to eat pork, or maybe there were other extenuating factors, stress, or other sins that created these genetic abnormalities that then function and ride on our genetic code. We've also noted that Ephraim's ongoing sin and idolatry. We've noted that Ephraim constantly attempted to substitute Yahweh as man's only creator with other deities, whether it was Baal, Asherah, or God's newly invented, as described in Deuteronomy 28:36. They were newly invented after Mount Sinai, and these were gods that neither Israel nor her fathers had known. They were newly created, and they would continue to be created as Israel was sifted among the nations throughout the diaspora. And today we're going to be looking at something that really challenges some of our inherited beliefs, because there is a tendency among us, even today, to think of Yahweh in very pagan ideologies. And this pagan ideology relegates Yahweh, his covenant, the obedience to his laws and commandments, to be only applicable within the land of Israel. As though once you're off the land, that covenant ceases to exist. As though once you're off the land, Yahweh no longer sees you. You're no longer a person or relevant in Yahweh's sight. It's as though he's forgotten you, your descendants, and you no longer matter to him. We're going to be looking at this today, because we're going to find something in Jeremiah that challenges this pagan ideology. But again, these came about because our ancestors, our beliefs today in accepting these types of ideologies come about because our ancestors had a propensity towards idolatry, and Ephraim still today is still dealing with this idolatry, as so is Judah. But the question that we're really at this fork in the road. Are we finally willing to admit that both we and our ancestors have sinned, and that we and our ancestors have departed from the way of Yahweh, and that our beliefs, many of them, are actually still departing from the way of Yahweh? So we've witnessed that, and again, this is the process of remembering that we're doing. So in our previous episode, we witnessed that Ephraim's split from Judah was orchestrated by Yahweh and Yahweh alone. It was God who tore Ephraim from Judah, not man. Solomon's choice to sin in idolatry and rejecting the admonition to walk in the way of Yahweh is brought to the forefront by Ahijah in 1 Kings 11:33 through 34. And this created the national fracture that we saw, that has existed for basically almost 3,000 years in Israel's history. But notice, Yahweh doesn't just accuse Solomon of simply idolatry. He actually accuses he accuses King Solomon of rejecting to walk in the way of Yahweh. So this goes beyond just simple idolatry. There's a rejection of ideology, a rejection of a way of life and of written laws that Solomon did not adhere to. Today, you and I are in diaspora due to the choice made by our ancestors to depart from the written Torah. Even the modern state of Israel evidences that the prophetic vision of a righteous Davidic kingdom still awaits. Modern ideas that Ephraim and his descendants are forever cast off, while Judah retains some sort of correct understanding of God, is the presiding belief today. But is that correct? What does the written word of Yahweh through his prophets tell us? We have walked through Jeremiah's indictment against Judah, which charged Ephraim and Judah equally with breaking the covenant, of committing adultery, idolatry, and walking contrary to Yahweh. This series is discovering the power of Leviticus 26 in healing these generational curses, the steps that we can take today in remembering, acknowledging, and admitting Yahweh's righteousness throughout this, what is really a horrific process. This process of remembering Acknowledging and confessing that our ancestors have sinned becomes a pathway to worldwide repentance, salvation, and Teshuvah. It is the action that allows Yahweh to finally remember his covenant with us today. But we cannot jump to the conclusion. We can't put the cart before the horse, because we all want this final redemption. We all want to have the gratification of this era of peace and salvation. But we have to walk through the exercises that Yahweh has given us to healing. There is no cheat to this process. There is, again, no instant gratification. We can't just skip ahead. It's not like, we land on go or free parking and we advance all of a sudden and we collect our $200. That's not the way this process works. We have to do the exercises. And the exercises begin at the beginning. We have to remember our past. We have to look at those points whereby we went astray. And we have to examine the actions that our ancestors took and the choices they made, so we can understand better our thought processes and the lies we have inherited today. Confessing our sins is actually the easy part, as strange as that sounds. We would think that us, dealing with ourselves would be the part that we would contend with the most, but it actually isn't. What we contend with the most, what we reject, and the status quo we desire, and what we hold so tightly to, are the sins of our forefathers. We guard them like innocent criminals, hidden away in dark cells. These sinful dysfunctions are so entrenched into our minds and hearts that we object even questioning them. We don't tear these sins down. We prop them up, despite the biblical evidence, the written word, the word of Israel's prophets, the words in the Torah that challenges these ideas. We still reject God's word today. We reject his counsel, his rebuke. We reject Isaiah and Jeremiah's words, just as our ancestors did 2,500 years ago. But now the lot has fallen to us. We are a new generation. We do have an opportunity of a new beginning. And the question remains, choose you this day whom you will serve. Will we continue to pine away in our ancestors' sin? Will we continue to walk in that way that did not profit? Or will we finally humble ourselves to look at what is written, to look at what is stated, and to objectively seek the counsel from the written voice of Yahweh? And again, this sin has created immense division between the tribes of Israel. It has created immense division among Israel and the world today because, for one factor, it fails to sanctify Yahweh alone and his name alone as Israel's God. Those who do not know the past are doomed to repeat it in the future. But it is by examining the past, understanding it, that we foster the opportunity to thwart repeated failures. It provides a means whereby we no longer hit one's head against that proverbial wall, creating the same mistakes over and over again. Understanding the past, remembering our history, allows us to finally jump over that wall, to jump over that hurdle to righteousness, as that stone of stumbling, as that wall that prevents our growth, that wall of rebuke. It allows us to finally go over it towards salvation and conquering our own sins, of creating within ourselves, as we saw last time, the instruction that we find in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It instructs us to create our own clean heart within us. And by doing that, we actually have to follow Leviticus 26:40-41, or that will never happen. So today we are going to continue the steps in this process of remembering. And I really wanted to set this up because I have something very difficult to talk with you today about, and it really extends the discussion from episode 116, because I have found that we think we are not affected to history, and we think that we have progressed so much further beyond the sins of our ancestors. But much like Texas and how Texas history affects us, ancient Israel's history, what occurred in Jeremiah's day, continues to affect us very much today in our daily beliefs and our daily seeking of the word and our interpretation of written scripture. And today we are going to be looking specifically at Jeremiah 39 verses 44, because the choices made by Judah's small remnant over 2,500 years ago continue to prevent worldwide Teshuvah, redemption, and reformation today. We so often read Judah's history in the final days of the kingdom, and we stop with the destruction of the first temple. It's as though all of a sudden everything else that occurred after the destruction of the first temple doesn't matter. But it's actually in this history that occurred after the fall of Judah that created two divergent paths in Israelite history today. And the power of this healing comes from remembering this act of rebellion. It comes from remembering the choices that our ancestors made, so that we today have the opportunity to learn, grow, and repent from those choices. To understand the past, again, we need to better grasp not just the history. I mean, we can read over the history, we can read over the words, and that doesn't really create the understanding that allows us to change. So today we are going to step back in history. We are going to take a very political understanding of what the situation that occurred and the events that occurred, the things that made this history occur, so that we can better understand and grow from it, and to accept that gentle rebuke, which is now gentle today, but it could turn into something much stronger if we again refuse to heed Yahweh's written word. So let's begin right at around 580 BCE, because Judah's history shortly after Jerusalem fell is one of intrigue. The Babylonian general Nebuzaradan had set Shaphan's great-grandson Gedaliah as governor over Judah. Shaphan was the scribe who worked under King Josiah to cleanse the temple. His son Ephraim often worked with Jeremiah under Zedekiah's reign. After Jerusalem fell, Babylon's Nebuzaradan had encouraged the prophet Jeremiah to seek refuge with Gedaliah in Mizpah. Jeremiah obliged, as their families had worked together in the past. They were allies against the wickedness in Judah. When Jerusalem was destroyed, Babylon established Mizpah on the northeastern boundary of Israel as Babylon's administrative capital district. Probably because it was just an easy point of access for administration over the territory of the lost kingdom of Judah. During Babylon's siege of Judah, however, many Jews sought refuge in Moab, Ammon, and Edom. They heard Jeremiah's words. They knew that destruction of the kingdom was coming. They could see the handwriting on the wall. So they fled to Israel's historic enemies, but to their neighboring homelands for the nation's fall. I mean, we see this today. We see this in Ukraine, where there's a diaspora of people fleeing in other nations. We've seen this in Venezuela, where 70% of Venezuela under Maduro had, and earlier under Chavez, had immigrated to the United States. 70% seeking refuge, shelter, and protection among another nation because the oppression and the crime and the violence was so strong in one's homeland. So this is what the Jews did as the kingdom of Judah came to an end. I mean, it's only a natural thing to do. But the temple had fallen in the 5th month of Av. Harvest season was right around the corner, and a large estates needed harvesting, but they lacked the workers who had been deported by Nebuchadnezzar. Gedaliah sent word. He sent proclamations throughout all the countryside, to Edom, to Moab, to every place, to Ammon, every place where Israel had sought refuge. And he urged them to return to the land and to help in the harvest so that Judah, the lost kingdom of Judah, could be self-sufficient, and the remnant who Nebuchadnezzar had left there could thrive, so that they wouldn't starve to death, and so that the land, the territory wouldn't fall into complete disarray and be completely worthless because the land was not worked. This remnant indeed listened to Gedaliah, and they sought refuge with Gedaliah at Mizpah. So this little teeny tiny remnant that Nebuchadnezzar had left actually grew to a much larger population under Gedaliah, just within probably the course of about 2 months. Now, this regathering also affected the political situation. And although Gedaliah was becoming stronger and his forces were improving, there was a very unsettling rumor that began to circulate that Ishmael, one of the few surviving Davidic heirs, had allied with the king of Ammon to assassinate Gedaliah. It is very possible that when Jerusalem fell, Ishmael was not even in Jerusalem because he had sought refuge with Ammon during Jerusalem's final days. Ishmael was Elishama's grandson. Now, Elishama had been part of the scribal alliance that had protected Baruch and Jeremiah. He was a royal scribe and part of Zedekiah's household. He protected the scroll containing Jeremiah's prophecy against Jerusalem so it could be read before Zedekiah. However, his grandson Ishmael had an entirely different heart. After Nebuchadnezzar deported the royal house, Ishmael found himself to be again one of the sole surviving Davidic heirs. Babylon had placed Johanan, a high-ranking general under Zedekiah, in charge of the kingdom of Judah's remaining garrison forces. Johanan discovered Ishmael's plot. He warned Gedaliah and asked permission to assassinate Ishmael. Gedaliah refused. He naively trusted in Ishmael's pledge, which had pledged fealty and loyalty both to Gedaliah and to Babylon. Now remember, the temple fell in Av, the 5th of Av. Then you had the harvest season, and what comes next after the harvest season? Sukkot. And as Sukkot approached, the Jewish remnant began to pilgrimage to Mizpah, to what was probably a very makeshift tabernacle that was established at Mizpah, the defunct functioning capital of the nation. Or it's not really even a nation now. It's just a governed territory of Babylon. When Ishmael's legion came to Mizpah as part of this, remember, this is a national celebration. So when he came to Mizpah with garrison forces, it didn't raise any suspicions. It was only natural for armed garrisons to come in force to celebrate Sukkot, because the actual instructions in the Torah actually commanded Israel's armed forces to attend the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals. You know, today, because we are separated from nation, we are separated from armies, we are separated from a government of Israel, we lose this context. But the context in the Torah is specifically that males in the army, that soldiers attend the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals. This was a show of force meant to instill fear in Israel's enemies. But now the situation is reversed, because this fear for Israel's enemies now becomes a threat to Judah and Judah's existence, because Ishmael used this opportunity to dispose Gedaliah and to reign as a defunct king over Judah. He killed and assassinated Gedaliah and his warriors. He also assassinated many of the prominent Jews who had sought refuge with Gedaliah, along with Babylon's garrison troops and emissaries. This was a wholesale slaughter, and so that very few of those refugees remained. And this massacre was so effective that not one person escaped to tell anyone else about it. Ishmael had complete control. 2 days later, 80 representatives from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria sought to bring offerings to the makeshift tabernacle at Mizpah. Again, this was probably very likely Sukkot, since Jeremiah 41 verse 1 mentions this seventh month in his account of these events. Ishmael slaughtered all of these righteous people who were seeking to come to Mizpah and their entourage. So this would have been all of their representatives, anybody who had any sort of tribal standing, of authority, or governance over their local districts. He killed them all. Ishmael also captured Zedekiah's royal daughters, whom Babylon had mercifully left in the land. This act of rebellion signaled that Ishmael intended to claim the Davidic throne through marriage to a legitimate royal daughter. Ishmael's forces and the Jewish captives began to retreat towards the refuge that Ishmael's alliance with the Ammonite king offered. Johanan discovered Ishmael's crimes and confronted Ishmael at Gibeah. When Johanan confronted Ishmael, everyone defected to Johanan for protection. This left Judah's remnant in a horrific dilemma. And I don't think that we really appreciate this today, because I think we just read this very anesthetically. We don't really put ourselves in their position to consider the horrific dilemma that this remnant was in. Because if they stayed on the land, they risked Babylon's wrath for their kinsmen having killed Babylon's governor, the emissaries, and the garrison forces. Johanan led the remnants of this royal house and the defect army and the remaining women and children to Chatham on the south border of Bethlehem. It was really this frontier town as the highway went to Egypt. These people were petrified. Nebuchadnezzar, just think of this. Nebuchadnezzar had slaughtered their king, the royal household, and anyone who had sided against Babylon and Zedekiah's alliance. Ishmael's action looked like a repeated offense that Zedekiah had previously committed. Would Babylon ignore it? Would Babylon not require for the lives of their garrison forces? Would they not see this as an act of rebellion against Babylon? And then, not only this, but any of their friends that were anybody of importance, anybody of talent, anybody, schooled in scribal abilities, anybody with talent to lead and guide Israel had been deported. So Judah really didn't even have people of talent to help lead them and guide them, because they were just the poor peons who did not have power in Israel's land, which is, of course, why Nebuchadnezzar could lead them. If the people are no threat because of the fact that they're uneducated, they're, your grunt workers of the land, there's no risk in leaving these people because they don't have the power or the wherewithal to rebel. But Ishmael had changed this balance. His actions created a situation where Nebuchadnezzar could send another army and totally wipe out this Judean remnant. So this reality was very grim. And it was really almost impossible for them to stay on the land because the trade routes were destroyed, their infrastructure was gone, this created a situation where they could starve to death on the land. Could they withstand a famine if a famine occurred? What about the roving bands of Ammonites, Edomites, Philistines, and other hostile tribes? All of these played a factor in the events leading up to this horrific and very much a crucial moment in Judah's history. A crucial moment that created a divide so deep that it has lasted through to today. History is powerful. Historical memory is powerful. And this Judean remnant remembered Egypt. They remembered the bounty that Egypt had to offer. In fact, anytime Israel's forefathers faced adversity in the wilderness after the Exodus, they would murmur and complain. Exodus 16 verse 3 records one such complaint. And this was the typical adage, to which now the Judean remnant, or Judah's remnant, was resorting. In Exodus 16 verse 3, Israel's forefathers had complained and said, "Would to God we had died by Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For you have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." Now the Jewish remnant remembered the bounty and the safety Egypt had to offer, and how it had provided protection to their forefathers. In fact, Yahweh's covenant with Israel had predicted that Judah and Israel would refuse to obey the voice of Yahweh in his written covenant, and that she would again return to Egypt's house of bondage, whereby Yahweh said they would never see again if they followed his covenant. This is what Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 predicted. It says, "And Yahweh will again bring you to Egypt again with ships, by the way of, I said, you should never see again. And there you will be sold to your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen. But yet no one shall buy you." Now, the statement here that no one shall buy you is the fact that it implies that this is self-inflicted. This is not Yahweh inflicting this return to Egypt. This is not even a foreign nation that is making Israel or Judah submit to servitude. This is their own doing, bringing their own consequences upon their own head by rejecting Yahweh. But Yahweh here again was not leading them into bondage. And the remaining Judean remnant was at a crossroads. They were at this point. Do they continue to go to Egypt for the shelter and safety that Egypt had historically provided? Or do they stay in the land? Now, the prophet Jeremiah had sought refuge with Gedaliah at Mizpah, and he found himself among Ishmael's captives and later among the people who defected to Johanan. Now, there's one thing about Jeremiah. If you read his book, you know he's not one to keep quiet when people depart from Yahweh. He's not one to keep silent when people defy Yahweh and they choose wickedness and they choose to walk contrary to Yahweh. And now was no different. So whether Jeremiah was talking to his friends and creating dissent, or whether the people suddenly remembered there was a prophet among them, we do not know. The text doesn't clarify that. But suddenly people did remember that there was a prophet among them, someone who had accurately predicted everything that had come upon them. He had accurately predicted Jerusalem's fall. He had accurately predicted the slaughter of Zedekiah's royal Davidic house. And he had accurately predicted the destruction of Yahweh's temple. This remnant was at a crossroads. They wanted assurance. They asked Jeremiah to seek Yahweh, pleading to know what they should do. Should they stay in the kingdom of Judah's defunct territories, or should they seek the shelter of Egypt? Much like the covenant between Laban and Jacob, The Jewish remnant invoked Yahweh as a witness as to witness that they would obey the instruction delivered to them through Jeremiah. In other words, the people, the remnant, what they did is they took and they made an oath and they swore in Yahweh's name, saying, whatever, please seek Yahweh for us, Jeremiah, and whatever reply that you give to us in Yahweh's name, we will follow it. And we are swearing that we will obey this word. We will obey Yahweh's command that Yahweh gives to you. And again, this covenant was very much like the vow and the oath that Israel and their forefathers had contracted at Mount Sinai. It was a commitment. And the people had expected Jeremiah's typical gloom and doom response. And that's likely why they were willing to make this covenant. But unlike his typical gloom and doom response, Yahweh offered through Jeremiah hope. Hope and promised salvation if this lost and very small and fragmented Judean remnant stayed in the land. Promises that they would grow and become a people before Yahweh again. The promise that Yahweh would be merciful to them once more. Jeremiah unexpectedly gave promises and assurances of prosperity, peace, and hope. However, his promises also came with a warning. If the Judean remnant fled to Egypt, they would face greater war, famine, and persecution than they had ever faced in the kingdom of Judah. Further, they would experience the same merciless judgment that had previously fallen upon Jerusalem. Yahweh would not show them mercy or their descendants any mercy that they had found within the covenant. And they would be banned from the promised land during the long day of Yahweh. Jeremiah further warned that he knew this remnant would not listen to them, since the entire kingdom of Judah had been rejecting his word for over 60 years. They had been rejecting his word for the entire duration of his ministry to Israel. The people had not expected this answer. And like the spies who rebelled after searching out the promised land, they claimed that Jeremiah was lying to them, that Yahweh had not counseled them to stay in the land, and further, they questioned whether Yahweh was truly God at all. Now, I think a lot of times when we read through this text, at least I know for myself, we miss this point. The Judean remnant, or rather Judah's remnant, it's easier for me to say Judean because of later history, but Judah's remnant questioned whether Yahweh was truly God. They said that they would do as they pleased, and they refused the heritage. They refused the promised land that had been given to their forefathers, that Yahweh had covenanted to them. This is what Jeremiah relates. And I invite you to turn to Jeremiah 43 verse 2, because all of our ideas, as we remember, as we obey this command in Leviticus 26 to remember our forefathers, how our forefathers walked contrary to Yahweh and Yahweh walked contrary to our forefathers. All those ideas have to be founded on the written text, or we will go astray and we will commit sins greater than our forefathers. So let's base our ideas on the text. Jeremiah 43 verse 2. Then Azariah the son of Hoshea and Johanan the son of Kareah and all the proud men spoke unto Jeremiah, saying, You speak falsely. Yahweh our God has not sent you to say, Do not go to Egypt to live there. Skip down to verse 5. So Johanan the son of Kareah and all the captains and forces took all the remnant of Judah that were returned from all nations where they had driven to dwell in the land of Egypt, even men, women, children, the king's daughters, and every person that Nebuzaradan the captain of the guard, had left with Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch, the son of Neriah. And they came to the land of Egypt, for they obeyed not the voice of Yahweh, and thus they came even to Tephines. So this accusation that Jeremiah is levying against them is that they refuse to walk in the way of Yahweh. They refuse to listen to the voice of Yahweh. And this remnant continued, just like Ephraim, to pine away in their forefathers' iniquities. They rebelled against Yahweh's promises, and they falsely accused Jeremiah of being a false prophet, despite the fact that his warnings against Judah and her people had continually come to pass. The Judean remnant's rejection of Yahweh's instruction here was absolute. They made it clear they were not only rejecting Yahweh, they were rejecting Yahweh as their God, just as their forefathers had rejected Yahweh as their king. In ancient times, gods were believed to be deities over specific territories of land. Egypt provided immense freedom for the Jewish remnant. They believed that since they were no longer on Yahweh's territory, that once they were off the land, they could worship whatsoever god they chose. Yahweh would not see them. He was powerless on foreign soil. They could soon heartily embrace Egyptian deities. In fact, they went beyond this. They blamed their father's God, Yahweh, for all their troubles, not because they had sinned and Yahweh had brought calamity upon them, but because Yahweh's laws were unfair and that their suffering did not come from Yahweh, but they attributed their suffering to other sources. Mainly, they attributed their suffering to the fact that they had not worshipped other gods. In contrast to the ideology set forth in Yahweh's covenant, where Yahweh says, if you follow my laws, you will be blessed, and if you walk contrary to me, you will be cursed. In contrast to this paradigm, Egypt's deities offered open hope and salvation. The people believed that if they were off the promised land, the terms of Yahweh's covenants would no longer apply to them and their descendants, that somehow they would be protected and sheltered from the terms of Yahweh's covenant. Jeremiah's warning exposes the lies hidden in this ideology, much of this ideology which continues to this day, among both the houses of Ephraim and Judah. Yahweh and his covenant were not confined to physical borders. Yahweh instructed Jeremiah to issue another indictment against this small Jewish remnant. Turn to Jeremiah 44, verses 8 through 15. There is no other way to fully understand and absorb the importance of Jeremiah's prophecy without reading this text in context. This text is crucial for our remembering so we can turn from our ancestors' iniquities, our ancestors' rebellion, and we can break that dysfunctional cycle of pining away, of festering in our ancestors' iniquities. That continues to this day. So please turn to Jeremiah 44, verses 8 through 15. We'll start there. You have provoked me to anger with the works of your hands, burning incense to other gods in the land of Egypt. We're no longer talking about in the land of Judah. We're now in the land of Egypt, where you have gone to live, that you might cut yourself off, and that you might be a curse and a reproach among all the nations of the earth. So notice these acts of rebellion that they continue, whether this is, and yes, Jeremiah is addressing this Judean remnant, but the covenant is clear that this is not limited to just this small Jewish remnant. These curses are still applicable to the Jews deported under Sennacherib, to Ephraim, to Naphtali, to all 12 tribes deported under Assyria and Babylon. But here, yes, there is a specific curse, a specific warning, and a specific prophecy that Jeremiah issues specifically for this small Jewish remnant that remains from the lost kingdom of Judah. Verse 9. You have forgotten the wickedness of your forefathers, and the wickedness of the kings of Judah, and the wickedness of their wives, and your own wickedness, and the wickedness of your wives, which they have committed in the land of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. They are not humbled unto this day, neither have they feared, nor have they walked in my law, nor in my chog. Here, chog is always, it's translated as statutes, unfortunately, but chog is always cultic regulations, something that has to do with the temple and priesthood, that I set before you and your fathers. And I do want to pause here because verse 10 states that this Jewish remnant in Judah's fallen kingdom had not only failed, but they had outright rejected Yahweh's law that he had given to them in Mount Sinai. They had openly rejected Yahweh's chog that he had given to the Mount Sinai, and they had even rejected Yahweh's voice, as we saw earlier. So their wisdom and their knowledge and their understanding and their own teachings began to supplant with their own traditions over the righteousness of Yahweh's written law. Continue in verse 11. Therefore, Yahweh of hosts, the God, says the God of Israel, behold, I will set my face against you for catastrophe and to cut off all Judah. And this is the difficult of the reality of scripture and prophecy, because we seek to differentiate ourselves modernly now from 2,000 years of the prophetic word. We seek to excuse our beliefs, our actions, not just of us, but of our ancestors. We seek to protect and defend actions rather than confronting them. But what does Yahweh state his goal would be towards Judah's Egyptian descendants, those who sought refuge in Egypt? Verse 12. And I will take the remnant of Judah that have set their eyes to go into the land of Egypt and live there, and they shall be consumed in the land of Egypt. They shall be consumed by the sword and famine, and there they shall die, the least to the greatest of them by the sword and famine. And they shall be an oath and an astonishment and a curse and a reproach. For I will punish them in the land that they dwell in Egypt, as I have punished Jerusalem by the sword, famine, and pestilence, so that none of the remnant of Judah, which are gone to the land of Egypt to live there, shall escape or remain, and they should turn to the land of Judah, that they should return to the land of Judah, to the which they desire to return to dwell them. None shall escape to escape. The Jewish remnant claimed that there was no such Yahweh that spoke through Jeremiah. In fact, they had favored Egypt's gods by burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and procuring offerings to her. Even as far back as they could remember under Judah's monarchy, they had been blessed with plenty of food, prosperity, and peace. This favor, they believed, was granted by Ashtoreth in the land, or Isis. She was known by varying names, but she was the Queen of Heaven. And this Jewish remnant believed that it was the Queen of Heaven that favored them, not Yahweh. They credited false gods with the blessing that adhering to Yahweh's written covenant had created. Further, since Jeremiah had encouraged them to forsake idolatry, they had faced nothing but adversity. Their king was killed, city was destroyed, disaster after disaster had fallen upon them because they believed they failed to worship the Queen of Heaven. Further, the women pointed out that when they had secretly offered wine and cakes to the Queen of Heaven behind their husbands' backs, their worshiping of the Queen of Heaven had protected the nation, and her favor had created national prosperity and national protection. Jeremiah replied that it was sin that had created their hardships, not prosperity. Idolatry angered Yahweh. Idolatry by their kings, princes, leaders, and the families had angered Yahweh, not their adherence to a righteous way of life. This is Jeremiah's response in Jeremiah 44, verses 22 and 23. Yahweh would no longer bear because of the evil of your doings and because of the abominations which you have committed. Therefore your land is desolate and an astonishment and a curse and without inhabitant to this day. Because you have burned incense and because you have sinned against Yahweh your God and have not obeyed the voice of Yahweh, nor walked in his law or his statutes, nor in his testimonies, therefore all this evil has come upon you to this day. This is the second time that Jeremiah accuses this remnant of rejecting Yahweh's laws, his hulk, his aduth. Here, testimonies, Israel's national covenant with Yahweh. This Jewish remnant did not understand Yahweh's law. Their wisdom was corrupted by idolatry, and they retained no inherent understanding or wisdom of the written word of Yahweh. Despite the people's protests that other gods had saved them from their sins, Jeremiah draws attention that their hardships arose only because they refused to follow the written voice of Yahweh, to walk in his written law, his written hulk, and his written testimonies within the law of Moses. There was no other cause for Judah's hardships. And even today, if we were to extend this, whether we look at Ephraim in diaspora among the nations, whether it's the Inquisitions, whether it's civil war, whether it is open war, civil strife, even today, the only reason for our hardships, the only reason for our persecution is because we continually reject the way of Yahweh. We reject the waters of Shiloh that go softly, and we continually try to replace Yahweh's words with something that he did not command us and a word he did not give us. Jeremiah replied that Yahweh had told them that their great sins had caused this adversity and that it was their violation of the covenant. But now the Jewish remnant in Jeremiah 44 justified themselves and that they would not acknowledge the terms of Yahweh's covenant that their forefathers had made with Yahweh. Yahweh would not allow his reputation to be muddied by this hardened and rebellious remnant. So he sent Jeremiah to take drastic measures after this remnant had rejected this word of Yahweh twice. The drastic measures would define, divide, and protect the house of Judah for the next 2,000 years. Like most prophecies, this drastic measure was not fulfilled right away, but over the course of the next 430 years, as Egypt's pagan idolatries began to mix more and more with the pure word of Yahweh, the pure word that says, "Thus says Yahweh," in the written law of Moses, became ignored, lost, and replaced by newer ideologies, by newer traditions, by newer gods created later in Israel's history. Surprisingly, Yahweh's drastic measures hinted many times within Jeremiah's prophecies, yet we read right over them without ever taking them to heart. There is a theme throughout Jeremiah that so many times we overlooked. And these choices made by our ancestors continue to affect our beliefs and our choices today. And we remain at the crossroads where we have to ask ourselves, do we have a humble heart? Do we have a humble spirit that is finally willing to look at the sins of our ancestors? Are we ready to confront our ancestors' iniquity? Yahweh says that when we love our neighbor, we rebuke him. Throughout the book of Proverbs, it is continually open rebuke, open rebuke. My son, listen to the words of my reproof. But we reject those. Our feelings are hurt. We circle the wagons and we protect. We resort to tribalism, and we call upon all of our friends, all of our teachers to justify us, to justify our teachings, as though somehow the safety in numbers will stand against the written word of Yahweh. But history proves that is a vain effort. Look at your history. Look at these prophecies. This week, study Jeremiah 44. Reflect on it. Meditate on it. Think about it. What history do we see of violence, of oppression, of Yahweh walking contrary to us? But there was something more in Jeremiah's words to this Judean remnant and this really is the last words of Yahweh in the promised land, the last words of Yahweh. Yes, there's Ezekiel, but he is in Babylon. We're going to see how in our next class, Ezekiel and Jeremiah are really kind of saying the same thing at the same time, despite the fact that they are separated by over 800 miles, because both are speaking according to Yahweh's Spirit, which is leading them to speak similar words and similar prophecies. And the words that Yahweh gives to Jeremiah creates a drastic intervention and has created a false doctrine that is one of the strongest doctrines today. It is jealously guarded, even to one's own detriment. It is adhered to, it is defended, and it is supplemented, and it is given as truth for the word of Yahweh. And it is this one doctrine that has prevented worldwide Teshuvah. It is a stumbling block to both the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. It is a stumbling block that separates us from a direct relationship with Yahweh. It is a stumbling block that separates us from our God. But if we are willing to follow Leviticus 26 healing code, Yahweh will today heal us from this. He will repent of all the evil that he has purposed against us for our own rebellion. He will no longer walk contrary to us, and he will remember the covenant with us and our ancestors. The question is, are we willing to continue the process? Are we willing to walk through this healing process? In our next class, we will reveal this drastic measure that Jeremiah took, that Yahweh told Jeremiah to take, the drastic measure that we still live under and we still adhere to today. Join me next time. From my home to yours. Shalom.